I'm delighted to be here again today with Matthew. And we had this email correspondence when I was sharing with Matthew a verse that I really like from Jeremiah 5:22, where God says, "I have made the sand a boundary for the sea." And I said, Matthew, would you like to talk about that? Because I think that is a fruitful topic. It's a beautiful analogy. And I think there are many levels of depth in that. And we want to talk about it from the angle of what does it mean to be an artist? What does an artist think they're doing versus what they're actually doing? And let's see where we go with that. So
I would agree. So I've went out on a limb, and I have decided to write a book, but not any book, but a book with all the limitations that implies. And I suppose, as anyone would imagine, it has not been easy, even though it's ironic that it's not so easy. You would think, as we narrowed the frame down to single steps, one after the other in ascending order, that it would be a cakewalk up the staircase to the last word of your project. But instead, because I've defined something in relation to everything else crashes at the door, demanding my attention. These waves are incessant on the pebbles of this intention, to the point where I'm not even sure if it's good anymore to have the intention I have. And so now I've replayed it as this warped spiritual crisis of, should I consider the boat lost, jump off, find an island and regroup, find some other project later? Maybe this wasn't the right one for me. Or do I batten down the hatches, let everyone else, all the other reasons, all the other intentions I can remember, get off the remaining safety boats and either sink with it or see it to its end? Because maybe there are connections within this limited frame to outside resources that I could not have guessed were possible at the beginning. And it is not without patience that one gets to a sufficient depth in the middle to see where those integration points lie. And I think this relates to how participation from others corresponds to the sort of inner character work an artist undergoes in making their thing, if they've given it a sufficient interval of time on the back end.
Yeah, I can certainly empathize with that, because one of the first inklings I got that I actually was an artist was that I had so much angst about the whole issue of painting. Every time I would think, okay, I have a path forward now, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I have a plan, I have a topic, I have a theme, I have my colors laid out, I'm ready to go. Who do I think I am? I'm a fraud. I could never do this. I have all these other things that are pounding at the door saying they need my attention. And it's way easier to go and do those things than it is to battle this out here, right here in front of this painting. And then I read that book that I've talked about before, Art and Fear, where the whole premise of the book is, you think you're a fraud, you think there's too many other things that are demanding your attention, you think you don't have the capacity to do this, your vision is too far out ahead of your skill, yabba yabba yabba, technique and all that, everything, it just all rises up to the top. And they said that's the first absolute proof that you are an artist at heart, because that's the way artists feel. They always feel that way. I went, oh wow, okay. Maybe I'm not a fraud. And that kind of got me over the hump and pushed me enough to where I was willing to persevere when the going got tough. And I think that was one of the first things that attracted me to Jordan Peterson, is that when he started describing what it is when you fall into chaos, but you can find the treasures there hidden in the darkness and bring them back out with you. That's always the way it felt to me whenever I started a painting. It was like I had fallen over into chaos, and the only way to finish that painting was to keep moving through the chaos and trying to find the treasures. Otherwise, I would have given up, you know? And so I'm sure in writing a book, that really has to feel like chaos, because every word has to get dredged up out of somewhere from within you, right?
And it's the medium of expression is the umbrella over these two topics. So expressing with the visuals, but also expressing with perspective and all the other parts of design that you have mentioned in other videos that together collaborate, but also dynamically contrast one another so that you get a representation of a thing that is not simple. In that, I would say, imitates conceptually the whatever it is that corresponds to an idea as it appears in one's body. I mean, often it has come as a thrilling sensation where I'm so excited about the thing that no one else can see in the room, and indeed is not in the room, and it's not between the synapses of my brain, but it's right there behind my eyeballs. And as you said, of the experience of knowing it is out of my reach. If I try to speak it at this moment, I will not do it justice. It will become a proposition. It will be a sparrow sold for 2 cents. Even though it's not sold outside the provisional care of God, in this case, the intelligibility of the artist that knows everything that sparrow could be and could represent. And so with very dainty, careful hands, gives it away in exchange. The recipient, by that value alone, cannot begin to appreciate what that artist is agonizing over as they're giving away this simple gift. And indeed, the simple gift betrays the world the artist is thrilled by in such a way that often the artist lives in deception. And this is one of the things that leads me to appreciate orthodoxy in my own spiritual journey through Christianity, is trying to reconcile that which is beyond my grasp with the day-to-day procedures of life, and not having those in conflict at the end, even though they must be in conflict beginning and middle. But while they're in conflict beginning and middle, I can't live with the added tension of an ethical transgression. So if someone simply says, don't tell lies, don't spout out or off deceptions, don't misdirect, be as clear as possible, I think to myself, you're asking me to die. And not even in a Christian way, because that won't even allow me to carry the cross up the hill. That just tells me to put the gun to my head artistically. For what you said, I mean, I can't give the sparrow away and say, well, this is what it is and all it is, because I'd be lying. But if I just shut my mouth and give the sparrow away with all my excitement, I'm still lying, because you may think it's still a sparrow, but I'm not at the point yet where I can say what it is, even though I know what it is. So the cognitive disjunction of knowing what something is versus how to represent it, it doesn't come simultaneously. And that marker of lag, how do you measure that in IQ? I don't think you can. And I think this is one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson says a creative person struggles to catalyze an identity. Not because they're silly or flippant or morally transgressive, even though if they have added vices to their character development, it may manifest in those directions. But the character of crossing lines in and of itself is not transgressive. It is exploratory, But also in that interval of exploration, the lag where an identity is not catalyzed is the invisible sap giving the tree its evergreen leaves. But again, none of that is at the level of representation yet, unless the artist, through every hammer on the finger, eventually builds something that others can participate in. And this is where Pajot comes into play. If it's an art for art's sake, it will eat its own tail. But if it's art for participation, as wide as one is able to bear, then it at least can have the conversational element of strangers. And I'm most comfortable with strangers, to be quite honest with you. And I think that's a function of artistry. And what I mean by stranger is, if there's too much familiarity with a work of art, then you might as well not have the work of art there. You might as well have the relation that mediates the unfamiliar with the familiar in the place of the unfamiliar. Because all it is, that's what it is. It's sweetness to the sweet tooth. It's shadow to the rage. So in conclusion, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts, the artist is in a place on the margin where they're living on the edge in a mysterious relation to the mysterious, where they are held to the same standard as a normal person. By that I mean an inartistic person. Because they cannot transgress. They can't be ethically delinquent. Both in the sense of they don't rob banks, but also in the sense of they don't steal without proper attribution. And that has nothing to do with copyright laws. It means if you're going to rob a tradition of its spiritual value, which one must when they create, you have to show its value for all it's worth. And that is proven, as wisdom is proven by her children, that the same sort of stranger, if they had lived in that era of time or in that country, will participate in your thing because they would have also participated in the value of that other culture. And I think that's one of the reasons why artists thrive amongst strangers as opposed to overly determined familiar conditions.
There's lots to unpack there. This whole idea of not being ethically delinquent. And so I wanted to ask you if you could parse that out a little bit. Do you think that there's a distinct difference between deception and fantasy, self-deception and fantasy? Because I mean, I know for me as an individual, I'm very susceptible to self-deception and very susceptible to sometimes living in a little bit of a fantasy world where I don't recognize, I tend to be kind of a Pollyanna in a lot of ways in my life. And so a lot of times I will not see the negatives where I probably should be seeing the negatives, or I don't recognize when things probably aren't going the way they should. And so I can make excuses for myself. And, you know, I know I'm susceptible to that. So I have to kind of keep my eyes open to that all the time, just in my personal life. But in artwork, I find a slightly different procedure or a slightly different developmental strategy that kind of is at work in the way that I follow the thread, sort of, in that I'll start down a road and I feel like, oh, I'm on the wrong road. So how do I get back to where I should be? Well, I'm not exactly quite sure of where I should be because I'm reaching in for that thing behind my eyeball that you talked about, you know? And so sometimes for me, it's just easier to create some more chaos explore those fuzzy edges that are out there on the margin, explore the monsters out there on the margin, and try to find some clues for how to get back to whatever the, we talk about telos, that there has to be some sort of purpose in the way things evolve and the way things change. But when you're an artist, you're moving towards a telos that you can't see and that you don't know and that has gripped you somehow, but you're not quite sure how to accomplish it. So is it deception to make those attempts? What you're really trying to do is to show somebody something that you yourself can't even identify. So is that deception, or is that just trying to kind of open a window to fantasy for others to be able to glimpse the same thing that you're glimpsing?
Well, to put it in a homely, HOMELY context, my priest said to me the other day, Matthew, your rapid racing of thoughts around a circuit probably is your cross. And I said to myself, I wonder what that could mean. And as a writer or novelist, I did not ask him because I did not want to know the answer from him. Because I did not want to know the answer from anyone. Because I did not want to know the answer now. Why didn't I want to know the answer now? Because belief can mean different things to different people. For me, I tend to use belief as a loan, Loan, where I make a deal with the outermost. I will believe that it doesn't matter what the person meant who said to me what they said with an intention. If you give me the time to wait, and I will, in exchange for that time, wait. But I'll wait with the intention of not leaving until you do something about it. So the end of the universe has to either, and this sounds crazy, but it's just an artistic way to say it. It's not crazy, but it's just a metaphorical way of talking about it. It happens in an instant. It's why I didn't ask him to explain himself. If I wait it out, and this has happened in the past, I find that the gears of the world as it is, the status quo, eventually give. And out of nowhere, as it were, drops the answer in such a unique fashion with resplendent parts that I'm excited to be alive. and with it, I can do something. With it, I can do something. And that signals to me there is more than the Midwest. There is more than my age. There is more than my annoyances, even more than my passions, to use a religious word. And therefore, patience for me has a capital P weight to it. I trust it. I trusted it at first brush with it in my freshman year of high school, when I was exposed to the play Waiting for Godot. And I was just, without any classical wisdom or reading in the history of the theater, I was just struck by the humor, the dark humor of these two characters and their non sequiturs. Well, what should we do as we wait for Godot? Oh, there's a tree in a tree limb. Let's hang ourselves. And then they don't move. I just found it so, I wanted to share it with the class I was in. And so I read it aloud, and there were some jagged edges of laughter. But I was giddy. It was so exciting to me because it made no sense. It made no obvious sense, but it was stated without qualification. And so I thought, if waiting could look like this and could be this neatly dark, then I will wait too. And it was almost an inverse argument out of suicide. Not that I was thinking of committing suicide, but it was on the surface of it, the words were commit suicide. And the inverse irony to it, I guess it was the discovery of irony, was don't, because there's so much more to wait for. There's so much more to wait for. We can't begin to talk about it. And I thought to myself, either that is the great project of an art that I would like to be part of and learn, or it's not. And I guess I've acted as if it has been. So I do think the whole Christian notion of carry your cross is similar in the respect of we're not asked to carry a literal cross. So why don't we update the metaphor? Why don't we? I don't know. For the same reason, I don't think we should update Waiting for Godot's first word in the title, waiting. Partly because so much fruit, and this is an agricultural allegory, so much fruit comes if you leave the tree alone. That's the thing. Artists have to be left alone, but they also have to leave themselves alone. And maybe that's what you're getting at here. If one leaves oneself alone, not to their own devices, because that's part of the ethical transgression, but they leave themselves alone in a certain way. It's the preparation for the work. Then they're in a place to receive cooperative advances from the divine or the mysterious or the muse or whatever you want to call it. There we go. Synergy. If you put yourself in a place, a particular place, on time, I've done this in writing the book. Certain times of the day, I break it up into 3 parts with an intention on each part, on certain kind of paper with a certain kind of pen. What obtains is not the product that I think I'll get by virtue of those actions with those elements, but what does obtain reliably is cooperation from what is not me, with what is me. And I can't put it any other way, because if I just showed up at a bus stop, and then on Thursday I showed up at my desk, and on Friday I did something else, and that wasn't recurrent, it wouldn't happen.
Well, I think that's the whole thing. There has to be this, we can go back to the God made the sand a boundaries for the sea. There has to be this ebb and flow, and it has to have a pattern that you are putting yourself in a space to participate on a regular basis. You know, they often talk about how important it is as an artist to have a daily routine, a daily schedule, a way of getting into the work, whether you go in and just do some kind of game playing and make little tiny paintings to get yourself going, get yourself moving, or whether you have a process for preparing your studio and getting everything laid out in just such a way, or you have to have some sort of a process that you go through that puts yourself in that space so that you have the intention that you're going to work every day. Maybe inspiration won't hit every day, but you'll get something done every day. And as long as you can't accomplish anything if you're not there when the inspiration hits. So you have to put yourself in the space where you, and I know this full well, because since I started this channel, I've done very little painting because I've put so much of my time into this, and I'm not out in the studio. Now, I just happen to have pushed myself today to go out in the studio and do some work. And it was really exciting to see the thing coming into form underneath my hands, you know, and I haven't seen that for a long time. So you have to be there. So the fact that you set aside, you have your 3 intentions every day, that's your process. I think that's terrific. And if we put this together with God made the sand a boundary for the sea, the sea has so many elements to it. One is the tides that come every day. They come in, they go out. But a sea also has this churning, you know, gigantic waves that can crash and roll against the shore. And yet the boundary remains. So it's not only that God made the sand, he also made the boundary. And he made the sand with a purpose. I think that's really interesting, that the sand itself has the purpose of being a boundary. So when I explore, if I go to the beach and I walk along the beach and I look at the sand and I think, what is it that makes the sand a boundary? And part of it is that passive way that the sand allows the water to just come in, and absorb the water, let it soak down in, let it percolate, and maybe that's part of that daily process of putting yourself in the place where you're going to be open to this, whatever it is that's behind your eyeballs, making itself known to you in your work.
And Peugeot talks about, to your element here, the difference between art for art's sake and then art for maneuvering the world. And when you speak of that ultra detail of the boundary having purpose, the sand having purpose, the water having purpose, with its depths of ontology, the tide, the eddies, the creatures therein, so on and so forth, it paints a picture of a cosmos, which recursively indicates the cosmos. And so in that way, even though I used many words, I believe it erases the pretension of art, because all of that maps onto any conscious being's experience of an environment and navigation therein and there too. And so in many ways, then, an artist cannot exist without tradition, and tradition cannot exist without the qualification we made to the artist, namely that the artist is a conscious being navigating an environment, and in that navigation, things are left in the wake, and also things are returned to in circular fashion, and this magnetizes others to come and see pattern. So Glenn, in an email correspondence, referenced pattern and process and how these things could bear looking into. And I think that's partly where one could look into them. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, nobody reads without being a creative writer. And so everyone who reads must be a creative writer, even if they've never applied their hand to a creative sentence before. In that regard, no one reads the Bible, no one reads the Constitution, but let's stick with the Bible. No one reads the Bible without being in some sense, the author. Because it's inescapable that meanings present themselves and we exclude and include in a negotiation, even if it's a monologue. And then we can check that with others, not just in conversation, but with the way in which a space is arranged, if we're aware of it or watchful over it. And maybe that's where the ethical delinquency comes in. A person could navigate their environment without watchfulness, but eventually, when they run up against error or an anomaly introduces itself, if they're not watchful, in one sense, they will not be expecting it. And they might be thrown into a loop of having to discover themselves because they weren't aware of their movement through for so long. And versus if they were watchful on the way to the introduction of an anomaly, then they meet that anomaly still as an anomaly because that's what it is, but they meet it as a different being to encounter it. They're surprised in a different way. They're not surprised in horror, they're surprised in a number of other factors or another variety of possibilities. And I think that sort of rules out the Ruliad in a way. I mean, the if-then of that Ruliad, where you can almost see the fact that given a few small steps, the increment will go on to infinity. It still doesn't argue for how we actually move through our environments. Like, I was reading St. Maximus the Confessor the other day, and he was talking about a metaphysical grammar. There's a this has been helpful to me in writing. I don't know if it'll be helpful in what you do, as you described that thing coming underneath your hands, taking shape, but maybe it will. You could tell me how you would phrase it. But he described the semantics of what he took to be Arianism, not Arius, a theologian named Arius, who he thought operated from a metaphysical grammar that goes as follows. Stasis, and then imagine a hyphen. Kinesis, or movement, action, hyphen, Genesis. Now you could map that onto grammar, because since it's metaphysical, it's meant to encapsulate the possibilities of being. And so you would expect that it scales up. So you can map that onto sentence structure, if you will, by saying the first part of that thing, the thing before the first hyphen, is subject. And the one in the middle is the verb, and the one on the right-hand side is object. So often, if someone's not watchful, they'll take a sentence for granted. Oh, I can analyze this sentence according to its subject-object-verb agreement, which is saying something, and it's not saying what the sentence says, so you're saying something about the sentence, but you're not saying all that you could say about the sentence, because maybe subject-verb-object is a pattern, the process of which is metaphysical, and you haven't made explicit the metaphysical process whereby that pattern is detected. So you might be, here comes the deception that you had said about self-deception. When I say you, I'm not obviously mean you, I mean a hypothetical you, me. And I learned this in my philosophy classes when I was in college. As Solomon said, nothing's new under the sun. We operate in metaphysical grammars, even if we're not aware of them. And there are not an infinite number. So that Ruliad, that if-then, imagine that as metaphysical grammars, which are limited in number. And everybody's operating on some, even if they're not aware of it. And it trickles up into how they understand subject-verb-object agreement. So two people could be saying the same thing with subject-verb-object, but they might have dichotomously contradictory metaphysical grammars. So that's preface to the difference between St. Maximus the Confessor and Arius, according to St. Maximus the Confessor. So Arius saw subject-verb-object as stasis, kinesis, genesis. So objects for him were generated out of the verb of a stasis, what he called a satiety. So when you eat to satiety, then you stop. He reversed that trend. And he said, what we should really ask ourselves is, why is there any movement at all? It does not seem natural. I mean, look at us. We're in error almost all the time. Motion must not be natural if that is the case. And so kinesis, movement for him, was this unexplained phenomena from an original static that we needed to explain. And we explain that religiously as sin. And the answer to solve that problem of movement at all is Genesis, generative beings, creatures in response to all this flummoxed action. And that's why, baseline, he would say that Christ was a creature generated as a response to all this erroneous action from an original stasis. So you can almost see then how he would take the logos became flesh in his subject-verb-object if he started with that metaphysical presupposition that all motion is bad motion that needs to be healed. And so if God were to assume, if the logos, the organizing principle of all things, were to assume our movement insofar as he becomes a human being and moves as a human being, then that response must be in response to the error of movement. And so he affiliated it. St. Maximus the Confessor said, wrong metaphysical grammar.
Well, let me just clarify here for a second. Was Arius the guy who said Christ once was not?
I believe so.
He was? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Insofar as he became a creature.
That's the Arian heresy. Yeah. Okay.
And I'm trying to explain that in terms of how he might have got there.
Yeah.
Through assuming that kinesis came from an original static. And so it must be explained. It's not treated as a good, it's treated with suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now St. Maximus, this relates to artistry, right? Often we think, oh man, 99 problems, and then I'll get a light bulb. I want to get the light bulb so I can eliminate all those 99 problems, all those kinetic misdemeanors, and finally pay up on my delinquency. I mean, it's a very powerful idea, and I could see why someone would be beguiled by it. I probably have been beguiled by it most of my life. I probably still am. That's why I'm working through it at such a fine-grained level. But St. Maximus came by and he said, why don't we reverse it? Because if we say Genesis-kenesis-stasis, we have different implications for subject, verb, object. We can say that, for instance, there was never a time that Christ was not. But we will never identify him with I love St. Maximus the Confessor. To me, it's far more profound because it's far more mysterious. Because he puts Genesis at the beginning and not stasis, that metaphysical grammar does not allow one to conceptualize the beginning, an absolute beginning, as either static or dynamic. What you're left with is the Greek word genesis or genetics, where we get that from. Literally a unit, not stasis, but it's a unit without interpretation. It's novelty. And from novelty, Genesis, subject, mystery, you get movement. Not by necessity, because who can know why the unique would carry out movement except the unique? But that characterizes movement in a different way from Arius's movement, in such a way that you can find yourself in the good of movement, and that being natural, according to St. Maximus. Everything has its natural movement, and it's good, but it's not explainable, because the origin of that movement, that which orders all the good natural movements, orders all movements altogether, is itself unique and apart from, not as static or as movement. And then at the end, the goal is being stasis. And I find this phenomenologically to be the case, because we're born into life. We're born moving. We live throughout our lives moving. And then we die as an act of movement from here to wherever. So the life that we trade in our language and linguistic structure is a life of passing away from one state to the next, a life of kinesis. And while Arius will look at that verb and say, 99 problems until we reach the light bulb, St. Maximus says, it's all good. Distorted, yes, but good. We don't need to worry about how to undistort the image. We can't do it. We're not in the position or perspective of the unique one. And while we can agree on the distortion, it doesn't take away from the essential good of the movement. And so belief then for Maximus is geared towards moving towards the end for which we move at all, a stasis, where in his language, the image finds its archetype, and the archetype is reflected in the image, and the image reflects the archetype in love. In love that isn't mere static, but it's the movement of love. It's the gathering of love together. So it's kind of static and active in the unique, which was the beginning. So it defies words, but it goes there, versus Arius's, all of its flummoxed, will never reach the original point. What we need is generative responses to these problems that mitigate for us solutions. Very pragmatic. You know, there's going to be there's going to be a tsunami, build a wall, build a dam. Generate solutions. Versus St. Maximus, we could build a wall, but even if it comes and doesn't destroy the wall, we're still going to continue moving towards our stasis. If the tidal wave comes, destroys the wall, carries us with it, we will still move towards our stasis. And in that way, I see the whole paradigm of patience through thriving in the metaphysical grammar of St. Maximus. But I don't see a lot of room for patience in the Arian metaphysical grammar. I don't know what you make of that.
I have a lot of thoughts. Just before we got on this call, I was reading, so I somehow I got subscribed to this academic journal that sends out a PDF a couple times a week of some topic that, depending on which topics you pick, they keep feeding you more of the same topics. And so I had been interested lately in time. And so they've been feeding me these scholarly articles about time. And the guy was writing about Aristotle's picture of time and how he was positing that perhaps scholars have misunderstood Aristotle's picture of time, because apparently, and you know me, I don't know a lot of this past philosophy. You're much better at this than I am. So maybe you could fill in the listeners on what Aristotle's perspective of time was. But this guy's view of it is that while time is certainly related to change, change is not sufficient to explain all that there is of time. So you can't make them an equal sign, right? But you can also set time up as being parallel to rest, right? So both change and rest can coexist within time from Aristotle's perspective, according to this guy that's writing the article. And I was thinking about that in terms of what you're saying here, because the stasis would be the rest, right? That would be the telos towards which we're moving, our Sabbath rest. That's our telos.
Yes.
And the in-between time, the movement, is the change. But both of those are a part of time. Both of those illustrate time for us. Both of those inhabit time. And it kind of fits together with Matthew Peugeot's idea about time, because he says that time is continuous while space is discrete. While most of the scientists today say that both time and space, well, they don't all say that space is discrete, but almost all of them say that time is discrete, that it's in little pieces and not a continuous flow. But I think it sounds as though Aristotle would say that time is continuous, but so it's one of these dualities, right? Not a duality in the sense of a Cartesian duality, but the kind of a binary duality where both of these things have they have a connection to one another in the way that one is illustrated by the other or by the absence of the other.
That's a good way to put it.
So Mark Vernon was talking today about Plato and the way that Plato looked at duality. And one of the ideas was that darkness is not the opposite of light, but darkness is the absence of light. But that light, he didn't say this, but what came to my mind just from thinking about how light and dark work in a work of art is that light is illustrated by the darkness. You don't know that the light is there except where it casts the shadows. And the casting of shadows is what tells you where the light is coming from, right?
Exactly.
So you have a duality there, but the darkness only has meaning because of the light.
And, oh, this is good. So in that regard, we can connect chapter 1 of Genesis and Heidegger's being in time in this way, because it relates to what you said about time being continuous through Aristotle. So in Genesis, isn't it neat how, I don't know the Hebrew word for it, but we're given the cosmos from God's point of view. And those values are placed in the perspective of God. Then we trickle down to, or we go up the mountain towards the garden, with the pinnacle of the garden being the image of that which put all the things in their place in the first place. Adam, and life, Eve. But when looking at Adam, earth, looking at creation, looking at those values, the one place where we have the absence of value, if darkness is the absence of light, think of it in a meta formation. What would be the absence of the principle by which those interplays of presence, absence come to be stacked up towards the garden, towards the epitome, towards Adam and life, towards Adam. That signal of that meta principle, following the same rules as those other principles, it is not good for man to be alone, for Adam to be without. Such a pregnant sentence as an exponent. So what I mean by exponent is, and this, I got this, I know we had a conversation in the past about the idealists and Kant and Germany, which is what my book is based on, 1841 Berlin. Exponents. Hegel, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, relies on exponential forms to move in his philosophy. The example being this: arithmetic is layer 1, characterized by the values of addition and its absence. But more than absence, it's digging away of presence to go for more absence. So it's using addition against addition, or in literary terms, ironically using this level against itself. And in that way, deriving this placeholder, subtraction. So on this level of arithmetic, you have addition and subtraction, which can be defined ironically as from addition. So one thing, one layer, no exponents. But then you can find an exponent, which means you're taking that level and raising it, all of it, up to the next level, while the next level is more than the bottom level. You're not simply moving the thing, you're moving the thing up into something else. Multiplication is the raising of addition, because it's a reflection on the relation of the relation of addition to objects. And it's expressed in that form, multiplication. Subtraction is lifted into division, which also is a relation relating those things related. And so nothing is lost, more is gained by raising to the next power these concepts. And there is power in that because it's an inverted pyramid. At first you think baseline, wide. But as you go into higher powers, you realize the opposite is true. What you thought was the widest base is actually the tip of a pyramid going into wider formations by exponential formation. But it's both and with Hegel. that thing that you raised up is just as wide as you thought it was. You can add everything, you can subtract everything. But when you raise it to the next level, from the perspective of that next level, that huge width is so small because nothing was lost into this higher mode. That works according to your definition of the continuity of time. If time was discrete, we would not expect that in the elevation of operations into higher motifs. So with that understanding of exponent, come back to Genesis, we have light, darkness, that interaction, the rest of the pieces in the garden. Then we have a comment on those pieces, raising them up into their higher form. With that sentence, it is not good, meta characterization of the whole level, for Adam to be without. Without what? Life is introduced. Eve is introduced. This higher exponented form, which is simultaneously the realization of the potential of every part of the bottom. So that God could say, be fruitful and multiply. I pun on that now, but that multiplication has meaning insofar as this exponential form does what I'm saying it does. They were to subdue the earth as tyrants? No, as prayerful lifters up, if you want to say it religiously, of all things into their higher form that is simultaneously wider and bigger than the bottom was thought to be. And to me, that jives with St. Maximus's understanding of motion itself, of things having their natural motion, and that natural motion of some things being exponented into higher forms, and that not being a generation. Like Arius had, stasis, movement, generation. Christ wasn't dropped out of the sky to respond to all these errors that were being proliferated. Rather, as some of the church fathers thought, even if sin would not have happened in the garden, God would have taken human flesh, because it was the natural trend of that motion to go into its highest, widest possible expression based on the intention of the unique perspective of the Creator. And so St. Maximus says, yes, there's sin, but God's still doing what he would have done in the beginning. And so in a weird way, we don't have to worry about the things we think we have to worry about. So maybe in a full circle, the artists think they're doing something, but in another respect, they're just acting according to natural motion. And I think art really does, in its participative functions, acts as an exponent that lifts up things. And in that lifting up, it doesn't narrow them to nothing. It doesn't refine them. It refines them by bringing them into more of what they are, not less. Although at first glance, it can seem like a narrow needle to go through. It can seem like a narrow way, but actually it is the way to more life, abundance of being. But now it's beginning to become mystical.
Wow. So if we think of the artistic process as the movement from generation through movement into rest, the completion of the process is the rest. So if I just think of it from my standpoint in doing a painting, there comes a time when it appears to be, to me, it appears to be complete. Why is that? You know, how do I notice that it's complete? What is it that falls into place? Because very oftentimes, just before it's complete, it's utter chaos. And it's just maybe one or two little last touches and the whole thing just comes into place. Now, that's a very mysterious thing. It kind of reminds me of this tract I read when I was a really new believer, talking about, I think it maybe is from C.S. Lewis, but it's talking about what it means to be regenerated or recreated by the hand of the Lord when he's transforming us. Behold, we are a new creation and the old has gone. But we tend to think of that as being like remodeling a house, taking the old house and fixing it up a little bit. But that's not what he's doing. He's tearing down the whole edifice and building new, completely new and fresh. But even if it were a remodeling project, the way remodeling projects work is that when you're in the middle of the remodeling project, it's complete and utter chaos all the time. You can't make, when we redid our kitchen, I couldn't walk through the house anywhere because that emptying out the kitchen exploded out and filled the whole house. You wouldn't imagine that so much stuff could be in a kitchen. So you couldn't even walk through the house for 3 weeks while they're working on the kitchen. And then when it was at its absolute worst, one day they put everything together, we put it all back, and then voila, you have a new kitchen. So you had a thought.
It's such a beautiful illustration, and it snapped into place for me what a saint is. A saint is a model given to humanity. Think of it as the one and the many in philosophy. It's a model given to show a natural motion for the recipient who can understand the model. I used a lot of qualifications because I want saint to be sufficiently wide, because there are many saints. But they all have the same quality of invitation. And they show, what do they show? They show a function. Function understood in computer language as the procedure of transforming input values into desired output values. And that's 3 things: input, output, and function that transforms. The function that transforms, it can either be obvious or it can be something not obvious stated in a problem statement. And the problem statement is like a clue to a detective. Well, I've got this problem statement and I'm interested in the solution to this problem statement because I'm interested, because I desire the outputs that it promises. That's why I am curious and why I give a damn and why I will model, why I will bear the load of all this excess from the kitchen, why I will walk over the pot, around the pan, and act as if it's not there. And someone will look at me and say, Matthew, why are you paying no attention deliberately to this mess around you? Why are you so recalcitrant? Why do you walk around the block looking down? And it goes back to that thing in the beginning of our conversation. Giving the sparrow, the artist is so thrilled, so concentrated on the importance, on the transformative function that he has discovered. And he is inviting you to see how the function takes the inputs and gives the desired outputs. But if they're not your desired outputs, you won't want to follow the argument, which is fine. Maybe it's not a function for you. Maybe it's not a model you want to remodel. But if it is, one should not expect, if it does all those things, that it would be ascertainable at first glance. Because maybe the process of transformation is a procedure with many steps. And if it is, then just as ideas start and then gain in complexity, fruit or come to fruition, and then bear the seed of reproduction, not all at once, And especially if you want to participate in it, you're not going to get it all at once. You're actually going to get the inside baseball language to it, which might tempt you to drop the whole project and deconstruct. Because as they say, now you're seeing how the sausage is made. And I used to think that was a bad thing, learning how the magic is done, learning how the sausage is made, seeing the mystery for yourself, participating. But that's the only way to be transformed, is to go through the function. And as you do it, the temptation arises as you see it being made, and it challenges whatever predisposition or bias you came into it as an input. Because let's get real, you don't have the perspective of an output as an input if the function is real and a real passage. So one would expect that if you go into the thing, you're going to have every bias challenged, even biases that you thought were the good, and correctly marked what you would expect from the outputs. That should also be challenged to the root if you're really going into a mode of transformation.
So is the function then the cross?
That's why I think,
because
yeah,
when you put your attention on the cross has this transforming power of changing all of the biases that are in the input into a new kind of an output.
Really, and yes, and now this leads us to recursion. Karen, I don't know why, but in this story I'm writing, tentatively called The Unstable Element, which has to do with lock picking as a mode of representing historical change. There are locksmiths and then there are pickers of locks, and they are not the same. And I'm fascinated by the difference. One is in the center and the other one's on the margin. Obviously, the lock picker is on the margin. And the locksmith is someone who's got the guild with him and has the equipment nearby to unlock any lock discursively, according to standards that the community will honor by converting that value into cash or goats or milk. But the lock picker, that mode of penetration is the stranger, is the individual, is the not yet explained, is the input with questionable output. Far more interesting to me is the picker of locks in a survey of history than the locksmiths of history. And it jives well with the phrase the unstable element, because that's how you pick locks. You feel the tension of an unstable element. And this was given to me through a conversation. I wasn't looking for this motif of lock picking, but through someone who demonstrated to me his lock picking ability, I saw, Karen, I saw the sparrow. I saw, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for in my main character, as a skill that would give me more than the skill. And it's what I've been waiting for as I've been writing the screenplay portions, directing time and action, because each chapter is 6 screenplay pages corresponding to 6 minutes, not because the novel will be so many minutes to be read, but I wanted to see that action in time. And I want to narrow it down to actions, but I still needed some sort of through line. And I saw through watching this real person pick a lock and open it up, and the glee on his eye, not glee on his eyes, the glee on my eyes, seeing it happening before me as an answer to my problem. I couldn't have guessed that it would be lock picking, but it's lock picking. And in seeing that, I saw the mysterious element through all the parts of action, the through line. The thing you can't see is the key, not the key, the pick that's hidden by the structure. And the one with the pick feels the tension on the palm. All of it is indirect and mysterious, and yet directly participated in. So this beautiful paradox embodied in a concrete skill hit me with just what I've been waiting for. And if I would have went to a guru, or if I would have went to a book, or arbitrarily sat down and said, this is his skill because he needs a skill, I wouldn't have gotten it. I wouldn't have been there to receive it. And I would have only seen it as a lock picking event. I would have seen it as someone with a sparrow in their hand. So I thank God for that I waited.
I wonder if we could explore this a little bit, because the image of the lock picker, Glenn and I have talked a lot about what would be the very, very, very basic thing that would have to exist in order for life to come into being, if you're just looking from a materialist standpoint. And that is that if you look at it from Glenn's point of view, that the universe is computational, then the simplest finite state machine is a lock and a key, because the lock has a certain structure to it which responds to a key. So when the key is put into the lock, if the key is of the right shape, then the lock will respond by opening. Of course, there still needs to be somebody to turn the key, right, in order for the lock to respond. So there needs to be something that has built the structure of the lock. There needs to be something that has refined the key to become the right shape. And then there needs to be something that turns the keys in the lock so that the lock responds. You have something to say, go ahead and jump in, because I can finish my thing anytime.
So what you said about the shape corresponding so that the structure can respond appropriately, the teeth moving up and the lock unlocking, creating space, more discreteness, with time that is even more than the discrete space opened. So time is over all of that, continuous, allowing for an opening that was not there before until the teeth were able to be responded to by the structure, partakes of what I was talking about with respect to the exponential forms, drawing from the lower without reducing them in number, but as it were, opening them up into a wider expression for their existence. Because when you unlock a lock, something is unlocked, whether it be the lock alone. Addition is unlocked into multiplication. Subtraction is unlocked into division. A cognitive subject can now operate on parables or ethical standards. This is the leap I make. Ethical standards mapped by the Sermon on the Mount give you the telos. Pile your piles in heaven. Do not pile your piles on earth. That tells you where you should put your keys to receive the best response. It's an investment strategy. What it's missing is what the parable offers, namely the cause or the motivation. It gives you the action, the ethical standard. Don't, and it does it with clarity. Don't do the action here, pile on earth. Do the action there, pile on heaven. But it doesn't give you a cause to do so, and it doesn't give you the motivation. You have to generate that yourself. And if you don't do it, you're a horrible person, says someone who misapplies the law and judges other people with it. But the parable doesn't give you the action. It gives you the cause or the motivation. So for instance, the parable of the man who had all this wheat and said, because I've got all this wheat and all this wealth, I better build a barn and relax a little bit. Once he built it, that very hour, the Creator came and said, your soul is required of you now. Who will inherit this barn and sleep in it? You fool. End parable. There's a lot to be enjoyed in that story, but what you won't find in that story is a call to action. You'll find many calls to actions, depending on who wants to interpret it for a specific end, but you will not find, as hard as you look, a response from the telos by putting the key of parable in, and vice versa. So those two things map onto that lower level of addition, subtraction. But the parable and the ethical standard can be raised up in cognition, because we can think about how parables relate. The parable of the barn and the wheat can relate to, pick another world religion's parable, or some literary adventure or literary representation. And you can say, well, it doesn't completely relate. There are additions to it made, or there are subtractions from it made. And I can appreciate those similitudes of addition, subtraction, and maybe then on this furlough, this discovery, exploration of all this fuzziness between all these different parables that don't have any umbrella of ethical standard, I can return to my laboratory, to my mind, to my studio, and say, whew, my desire for how interesting that story was, which is a kind of measure of my drawnness to it, has been warped a little, shown to be a little too much for the subject, a little too less here. And so I've qualified it some. I've figured it out a little bit. This key didn't work, that key didn't work, but it's okay. I have something in between those two keys called my intuition, my experience from time. And so I can take a little pick. It doesn't have to be a key. And because I've had experience with all these other locks, these ethical standards or these parables, I can go up to one that's similar enough by similitude and pick it, maybe penetrate into it. And it looks like magic if you do it fast. That's due to the fact that you've exponented those things at the cognitive level. But the cognitive level is lockpicking. And as such, it's a stranger to all invitation because you pick your way into a door. So you can unlock a lock itself, or you can unlock a door, which leads you into a world. But you weren't invited in. You weren't part of the guild of locksmiths called because it's an emergency. And we often do that when we survey history. That's part of what this book, The Unstable Element, is about. How we appropriate history as lockpickers. And sure, we can enter if we're quite good, if we've had a liberal arts education, or if we're computer scientists and we can parlay with other engineers. But if we pick the lock and we enter, we're breaking it, even though we've applied the same exponential function. And I think that's I dare say that's very profound. Go ahead.
Well, because what you just said fits right in with what I was going to say, which is that one of the other things Mark Vernon was talking about is the difference between proofs and analogies. Because throughout much of the history of science and mathematics, everything has been based on proofs, which proofs, as I understand it, are made up of certain assumptions and certain logical consequences and so forth. And so you get this chain of proof. But an analogy, the way he described an analogy, is more like something, he said something like a cracked pot that lets the light in. But I also thought about it being more like the cracked pot that lets the light out, because they say a lot that like a parable to me is a picture of an analogy, right? And so a parable is filled with light, but we can't always access all the light that's in a parable, because the light that is there only has meaning for us when we get into a situation where that piece of that parable fits the situation that we're in right now. And so then it's like a lock and a key at that moment. That analogy fits this situation. Oh, now I see what he was talking about. But I can be in another situation that's quite different, that another aspect of that parable will fit with. And then that will open that door. So parables are have this function of constantly opening new doors into new vistas and opening more doors into ourselves. We can see deeper into our own, quagmires or creative opportunities or whatever. Parables just keep opening doors all the time.
So in that regard, if the parable opens doors all the time or shows us the possibility of opening doors all the time, and it's now a matter of time for us to come across such doors that were promised in the implicit light of that parable, which motivates us to keep living, keep looking for applications. The ethical standard, on the other hand, tries to constrain the input. It says, don't pile your piles on earth. Well, that effectively wipes out half of the doors. But then the question becomes, does it reduce the cause, the intensity of the parable? That's the negotiation. Because one would then have to say, okay, I want to have my ethical standards next to my parable, so I can have my cause with my telos, because I want to push my cause as deep into telos to reach telos as possible. The telos is an invitation. So as I was saying, we can break into all the doors we want to, or can, through sufficient similitudes of memory or analogy, but that doesn't tell us if we open the right door. In other words, it doesn't invite us in. It lets us break in. An ethical standard is an invitation to a locked door. An invitation to a locked door that the parable can stand as the key with. So sometimes, as the parable of the virgins, you will come to a door that is locked, one that you were invited into. But you came without the light, without the cracked pot, without the key, without the watchfulness that would have been required for you to pick up on the similitudes, to be ready, a readiness. The parables teach readiness. And so that's why a Pharisee can become a Pharisee. They can have the ethical standard to a T, but they don't have the cross. They don't have the right similitude. And I think this is why, to me, it's a beautiful apology in the old sense of apology. It's a beautiful argument for why the only person who will teach us the law is Messiah. I mean, the Pharisees, the leaders, the teachers, they will show us beautiful things about the door, and they'll teach us why it's locked now. And if they're really, really good teachers, they'll encourage us to wait. But they won't identify themselves with the king. They'll teach us why it's so important to wait and why we should want to wait for the king. So then when the king comes and either opens the door or is standing on the other side of the door with it locked, but he's prepared us along the way so that in fear and trembling, we either pick it or we have the right key to unlock it. It's a meeting of both in freedom. Now, often that cracked pot suffers its expulsion of light. And this, I think, relates to the cross, because we find ourselves most of the time suffering for our causes, our values. And that transformation is a tricky one. It hurts often because so much has to be burned off. So much has to be understood as input that must be completely reverted to become output. And so we suffer, not as a good in and of itself, but as a natural course on the way to non-suffering. It's not non-suffering to suffer, but suffering to not suffer. Whether you want to look at that as falling off a bike in order to learn how to ride a bike, or learning how to pick up on similitudes from a lot of deception in order to finally pick the lock or have the key ready for the king. And this relates to the artist who sees more than they have the technique to grab, because maybe that's a sign to keep waiting for more teeth to align themselves to, in the darkness of the mystery, turn. And so,
well,
yeah, I agree with you and Glenn.
What you have to do is you have to keep moving forward with the light that you have.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, simultaneously developing the skills to get to the higher vision. So you keep moving ahead in the imperfect way at the same time that you're developing more skills to move forward in a more perfect way. And so, I mean, the fact that your vision outruns your skill isn't a good reason to just give up, right? So you just keep going with the skills that you have, but then you keep adding skills so that you can get closer and closer to the vision ultimately.
That is hell. To see a vision you cannot reach and you stop there. Right? It's the rich man who was burning in Hades, able to see Lazarus and Abraham, but not being able to reach them. And telling them, please go and do other things. I know you can't reach me, but go and do other things. It's like telling that vision to do things knowing you can't reach. That's hell, or a depiction of hell. It's part of a similitude, it's a parable of the experience of being in hell. So in this sense of suffering, to be in hell is to be where we have a vision that we cannot reach, but it does not imply that we should stay in hell. it means we should want to get out of hell by, at first, any means necessary. And then as we learn, we can't get out of hell by any means necessary, to do it with a certain kind of faith that reliably provides inches and miles out of that hell. It's a wonder that we can develop skills at all, let alone build skills on skills, but we do it if we're patient. And as you said, if we're discursive. This is where Heidegger comes in that I promised earlier. He really changed the face of 20th century philosophy by going back to Hegel. So I talked about Hegel's exponential forms. I think Heidegger did that with respect to a more homely analogy of the carpenter. So he would say a carpenter has an office, and as they're working, they have an intuition of where all their tools are. They won't put it in explicit propositions, but they know, because if they walk into it one morning and one of their tools, the hammer, let's say, is missing, immediately that absence will be felt to their circumspection. So circumspection, imagine a circle that envelops the creative or the agent, and that it's not infinite, and it's not something that you can ever reach the limit of, because it's this web around you. It's your environment. It's what allows you to sit down in front of that painting and out of nothing make it. It's all that invisible circumference that's been the accumulation of your techniques and experiences that, as it were, when you sit down with the proper tools, then come into closer view and filter down behind the eyes out into the thing. And it's this conversation with your discursiveness, the level of your ability. And when you, let's say you're doing that and you're so into it, you're focused, you're concentrated in your circumspection, and then you reach your hand over to that one particular kind of brush, which has a particular number of hairs, and you know right where it is in that vial, and you're picking it with your finger. And as you're looking at it, you're looking for it with through your finger. You're not looking at it. You're feeling for it across the butt ends of all the other brushes. You come across the fact that it's not there. So now immediately you're out and you say, what? Or you yell, hey, metaphysically, we often yell out, hey, where's the, because circumspectly, the absence of equipment announces itself as a problem to be solved for our being, not just any being, but our Dasein, our being there. The absence of that kind of brush announces itself to you through your fingers at first, not even your hand. You develop such an integrated whole known as your being there that you feel it's not there. So that then you direct another resource to it to verify the fact. You've confirmed the phenomenon of that valuable thing's absence. And then you respond to that unlocking of the rest of the world's disclosure into yelling through the wall to the other room, did someone walk off with my paintbrush, number 0.5? And that's how the world, in a Heideggerian, and I would argue 20th century continental philosophical view of things, how it describes the unfolding of world to being such as we are.
Well, that is a topic for another day. I would enjoy doing a conversation on Heidegger and the whole concept of Dasein, because that was something Michael and I talked about a lot at the beginning of the channel, and I had never done enough research into it, but I think you and I could have a fruitful conversation about that. But meanwhile, that little analogy that you built there made me think about the creation, when all is good, all is good, all is good, all is good, and then the lack of the one thing was made visible by all the good of all the rest, right? So it's like the circumspection. There's all this beautiful creation, but there's a lack. The lack is very evident only because of the perfection of everything else. It is not good for man to be alone.
Can I say one more thing to that?
Yeah.
Just to round it out, I hit my head against the table, metaphorically speaking, these last 2 weeks as I've been writing the screenplay for this book, and discovering that for me, it's been an important object to decide why, and you can frame this in many ways, but I will choose to frame it in this way. why did the Logos, the organizing principle of all parts, assume flesh before the invention of the printing press? Why were the pyramids of Egypt built before the construction of a video camera? Why were the great orations in Greece of Cicero given before recording technology? How were they able to do it, in other words, before this method of representation came on the scene? Before movable type? How were these types of world revolutions possible and in fact actual, so that all the movable type at our disposal is a response to the wake of that reality, which we cannot access in its primordial happening, but we get, as it were, filtered through these distribution systems. And if you want to frame it as God, why would God have all these things happen before we could prove it? By looking at a representation. I think it's the wrong question to ask for the following reason. Before people had the printing press, before they had books in abeyance to refer to so they didn't have to remember, they remembered and they argued on the basis of memory, and they changed their worlds, their laws, their self-understandings according to memory. How are they able to do that? That's even more impressive than writing a book, to me. But even though writing a book can participate in that, maybe in an exponential form through the lock and key analogy, but they were able to do it because they could remember. Now in computer science, after you have the whole definition of an algorithm as transforming inputs into outputs through a function, you have the definition of recursion as an equation or inequality that describes the function according to smaller instances, smaller inputs, to reflect the same behavior or the same transformation into outputs of larger instances or inputs. And I thought to myself, that's how they did it. That's how they came to terms with, say, the Logos assuming flesh before a printing press. Mm-hmm. They recursively reminded themselves of how this sort of thing happened before in smaller, more understandable inputs, stories, parables, remarks, maxims. And then they sort of navigated their way creatively through those smaller recursions, often hitting walls, saying, nope, that recursion doesn't fit. That's the wrong instance. Put it out. Let's find other ones. Okay, here in Isaiah chapter 5, nope, that doesn't fit. Chapter 7 talks about a virgin. That's a little recursion. Maybe it's the recursive case. So hold that in abeyance. We might need that later. But they could do it at a table talking, because they had figured out a way to boil down things into their really quick impressionistic images and communicate verbally their memories by putting together those impressionistic images. I've looked at old copies of Shakespeare's plays. They're nothing like the nice, clean, logically connective translations we have in English. It was crazy. Like when Hamlet was talking, he was talking about flour exploding and this thing and that flower and then this elephant. All these together, and I didn't know why, but now I'm starting to see that pathos was arrived at by the audience. The audience before the printing press didn't listen the way we listen. They listened recursively, because that's how they thought. Their thinking often was, and maybe this is true for us too implicitly, but their thinking was a constant function of transforming inputs and outputs that they described through their stories that were recursive. Last thing I'll say about that is, if you read the New Testament, people will say the gospel is the Old Testament, the new. If you read the chapters of the New Testament, especially in the Gospel of St. Matthew, because that's the one I'm reading now, often if you just linger on the way the sentences are arranged, you'll find that it's actually recursive to stories, maybe a little bit larger or even a little bit smaller in the Old Testament. And so really the whole New Testament is making sense of the Logos becoming flesh by going back to the old stories and putting those little stories in different patterns than they were before to make sense out of this new event. And so it was people having a conversation about how should I still remember what I remembered? What should I let go of in order to now understand this new reality? A book on a shelf not read doesn't afford that same contemplation, but people talking about a book can represent that same activity of people operating with their memories in the way that I described. So recursion before movable type to understand these things that may have really happened, and I believe really happened, matters to the artistic journey then and now.
That's a great wrap up, Matthew. I like that. And I would like to pursue that too when we have our next conversation about Heidegger, because I think there's a lot there in the 3 questions that you asked. But I gotta go. So
Yep, see ya.
this has been wonderful. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.